for inviting me to moderate this interesting and very important panel discussion, which the topic is extremely relevant for our region and also for our times. Not only because of the pandemic, but also the political situation. So I find this topic extremely important, and I'm really honored to be able to moderate with such great panelists. I would like to also welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are looking forward to discussing the matters with you. So like Wojtek already encouraged to the active participation. I think this event is based on, is envisioned to be an interactive event. So please feel free to join us at any moment with your questions. Before we start, let me introduce to you our participants. I would like to start with Simona Merkinaite, who is a project coordinator with the Open Lithuanian Foundation, but also a coordinator of the Rethink 1989 project, which I hope Simona will tell us a little bit about as well. My other panelist is Quincy Cloet, who is a managing editor of the Visegrad Insight, but also the author of the most recent report published by Visegrad Insight, which tackles the state of civil society in Central Europe. The report is titled Civil Society Futures in Central Europe. And I also hope that we will hear a little bit about this report, and it should be an inspiration also for our discussion in the Q&A session. And my last panelist is Miłosz Hodun, who is the president of Projekt Polska Foundation, but also an international advisor to the Polish Liberal Party Nowoczesna, and a member of the board of directors of the European Liberal Forum. Thank you for joining us. Welcome. My name is Iwona Reichardt, as Wojciech introduced me, and I'm indeed the deputy editor-in-chief of a magazine, New Eastern Europe, which also focuses on the region of Eastern, but also Central Europe to some extent. Before we start, I also would like to share a few organizational pieces of information. First of all, how our panel is envisioned to be structured. We will start with brief presentations, and here I would like to ask the panelists to be to the point and as brief as possible, maybe around 5 minutes, to share when they will be sharing with us their introductory remarks. After this, I would like to open the floor to discussion, and I encourage you to ask questions by either raising your hand or putting your question in the chat box. But please do limit your question to 1 sentence or maximum 2. And the panelists, please limit your answers to maximum 5 minutes. Because as you all know, we live in a Zoom fatigue times, and I think to make this discussion, as it is an important topic, let's make it also lively and vivid, so we will all remember what we were talking about. This is of course a recommendation, not a mandate, but please keep this in mind. So let us start our discussion right now. I would like to start with Simona. And Simona, if you could please share with us your thoughts on the situation of civil society in our region, in Eastern and Central Europe, but also tell us a little bit about the project that you are currently working on, the Rethink 1989, from that perspective of the civil society involvement.
Thank you so much, Iwona, and I want to thank you for Wojtek and Visegrad Insight for inviting me. I must say that I have an extensive background working in civil society, but for the last, say, 6 years, I've been more, had a look from the outside, as I work mainly in academia now. So, but this project that we are doing, 1989, is exactly focused on the premise that currently the democracy is in some kind of crisis. And while this democratic backslide has global scope, the fact that it happens at the time the democracies in Central and Eastern Europe are still very young and are just in the stage of forming of tradition of democratic participation is extremely important. So a few insights that I want to share with you now based on the project that we are doing, which is focused on understanding how are there any specific reasons why this backslide of democracy is happening here, because we still have the same people that the brightest figures that accelerated the democratic revolutions and executed the transition are now the fierce critics of all the ideas that built the movements back in 1989, like personal liberty or liberal democracy and the unified Europe, only proves that point. However, I think that in the moment of crisis, as well as today contemplating the future that holds for civil society, I think it might be important to go back to the basics and to really, maybe for us, people working with civil society and in civil society organizations, to actually ask what really civil society in our countries means. And I think that the past is very instructive here, mainly because we are in such close proximity to the Soviet past. I think, at least in the Baltic states, we can talk about the inheritance of the Soviet understanding of the relationship between civil society and the state. Back when any form of self-organization was pretty much an extension of the official ideology and the government. And I think this is something that we can see today as well, especially in the smaller regions of our countries. At least I'm talking about the Baltic states here, where civil society depends very much on the local government and pretty much still does the government's bidding, which of course raises the questions how much civil society can involve as the independent entity. And this is also why I think the idea that civil society organizations are representatives of some foreign interest, and that criticism that any civil society organization, as part of their duty of overseeing the government, comes not from civil society, but are extension of some foreign intervention, and it falls on pretty fertile ground here in more than one country of post-Soviet space, I would say. And this is only one of the aspects how, you know, our past impacts how civil society works and how developed it is and what future it holds. But of course, the 1989 signifies a moment of descent of civil society from the state, and this is very important. And sort of the affirmation of the agency of the people in the public realm. And here for civil society, I would outline a few lessons. I think first and foremost, I think the most important is that democratic revolutions were realized through wide civil participation, right? Today, when we talk to people and historians who participated in those events, they talk a lot about those movements as elite movements of intellectuals. But at the same time, I think it very much depended on small and yet widespread acts of civil disobedience. And this is where, like Havel would refer to the power of the powerless, right? When under the occupied rule, even the smallest changes one makes to their routine can become a political act of resistance. Today, this situation is vastly different. There are quite a high level of distrust among society, in the society. And while there are much better conditions for self-organization, which is also proved by the increased number and variety of protests, I think. But it also is harder to achieve meaningful impact. As paradoxical as it may sound, I think the dissent is more visible in non-democratic regime than in democracy, and this is something for civil society to consider. I think another point is that the political engagement, as soon as one decided to engage in public realm, had a very real consequences back then, right? So the political engagement had its own risks. Today, the speed and the ease with which people can put their voices to the number of causes, different causes, makes the social participation less meaningful and less organized, I think. And this is also something that comes as a challenge for civil society organizing. And I think that's also something that we need to think through. And this is not to say that, for example, mass protests are not separate and important way of civil engagement. But still, even as wide and as massive the resistance actions were back in 1989, they did have leaders that followed through with the demands of the, let's say, of the people. And now the organization of mass protests do not necessarily need such leaders. And so a lot of noise is being created, and it sort of, I think it creates a false feeling of meaningful engagement. Another thing that I would mention briefly is that the revolution of 1989 had not one cause and not one meaning, but there are a lot of meanings and a lot of causes. Yet it became such a force because it unified diverse groups of people with different backgrounds and that groups that organized themselves around different issues, like social issues, environmental issues, and yet they somehow thought could find a common ground, right? And I think this is something that we forgot about after the successful revolutions, and often the civil society and organizations act as sort of in competition to one another. And I think that the wider the need for wider partnership between different causes and different groups is just being realized, and this is something that we also need to develop. So briefly, those are the key points. I think that I think it is important when we think about the future of civil society to consider our heritage that we have, and there are very different things that come on in a very short span of time, in 30 years. And I think when we talk about the future, this is also something that we need to consider and learn from. And this is what our project aims to do. So that's briefly it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you for putting it together, how this history was supposed to be such an inspiration, and it is in many ways, but at the same time a source of such deep divisions these days, yes, and how maybe unexpectedly this has evolved for many of us, but indeed it has gone into this direction. Now I would like to move to the report that is also an inspiration for today's discussion, and analyzes the very current situation. So I would like to ask Quincy to present to us your thoughts on the state, but maybe more challenges of the civil society today. And if you could please tell us a few words about the report you authored.
Thank you, Vela. I'll briefly maybe talk a bit about how I think you can approach and understand the report, because it is a scenario-based report. It's not just about sort of the outlining of trends in Central Europe, but it's also about looking at possible directions civil society can take in the next couple of years, and to understand it also from a policy-making point of view. What sort of challenges, as you rightly pointed out, and how you can respond to these challenges by taking certain decisions, either as a civil society or different actors. So that is a little bit the idea behind it. Now, when the report was envisioned several months ago, this was still around the time, maybe even just before COVID-19. So the initial idea was really to look at trends sort of already taking place in the last 5 to 10 years. And you'll see that from the report as well. I focused there on sort of the political, economic, and social dimension, which I think are still very much relevant in the given situation. Because if you look at sort of civil society in Central Europe, when we talk about it in the sense of an operational space, if you look at every international indicator from the last couple of years, the situation is either stagnating in some countries like Czechia or Slovakia, or it's declining in others, in particular Hungary, but to some degree as well in Poland. Same thing when you look at financial indicators, and if you talk to civil society representatives, the aftershocks of 2008, 2009, the financial and economic crisis, are in a way still being felt. And the economic financial situation of civil society organizations wasn't great to begin with, even before COVID-19 in a way struck, and which is going to have significant financial impact as well in the next couple of years. And then if you look more from a sort of a social dimension, then, well, there are a couple of challenges that civil society also has to address now, either forcibly, for example, the shift to digital activities, how to organize a range of activities for the community online, if because of a pandemic being restricted in a physical sense, but also how to best prepare yourself in reaching out to people, whether that is, for example, for crowdfunding, for building active participation. That's a challenge. And I think that challenge interlinks as well very much with a generational change. And I think this is also about what Simona was talking about, 1989, and especially the important role also some civil society organizations played in the 90s. People that are active or were active then and are sometimes still active now do have a very different conception of what civil society is and what it should do as well, especially in a climate today, which is maybe more difficult because of polarization or because of limitations to civil liberties. So there are very different views there. So the report also tries to address some of these questions, how it can reach out also to a younger generation of young people that are much more at ease with digital tools, but that might look very differently also at civil society and what it represents for them. So those are some of the longer trends the report tries to tackle, but it also looks very much on the impact of COVID-19 and the attempts within civil society, but also more generally, which have or being undertaken to prepare and also to protect this sector for the next coming years. And I think you'll see as well that there are a lot of very diverse recipes being tried out depending on the country we're looking at. The second part of the report, as I said, it is a scenario-based report. So I roughly outlined 4 scenarios which are intentionally distinct in the sense that it's well possible that the future of civil society will have a combination of some of these elements of these scenarios, but I think it's good to highlight the different directions because it gives a clearer sense of what are the options and what are the possibilities, and also the ambiguities, because each of those scenarios may have a couple of pluses, but there's also clear downsides to some of them. So that's something important to take into account when reading those scenarios. Roughly speaking, I would divide the 4 scenarios sort of 2 and 2. The first 2 scenarios are where the role of the state is actually quite important. In the first scenario, stifled civic space, this is because essentially because of COVID-19 and sort of repeated waves of the pandemic, there might be a tendency of restricting civil liberties more than what is actually needed for the sake of security, but it might have a sort of an excessive or disproportional effect on civil society. And this would follow some of the developments which have happened in Hungary over the last couple of years, but which could see themselves exported to other countries. The second scenario is rather looking at it from an economic angle, and sort of the severe financial impact and how potentially the state in coordination, cooperation with civil society may find a way out of this. But we're talking here about a very fine balance between retaining the independence of civil society and at the same time also having to find a degree of interaction and agreement with state actors on questions of survival of the sector. And then the two other scenarios are more envisioned as where the state is relatively absent. And there I look at how, for example, this embrace of digital, of crowdfunding activities can play a role from within civil society. And then the fourth scenario is rather where that wouldn't happen, but it's actually very much dependent on other external actors, for example, businesses, for-profit sector, which might step in and also because of its own interests, try to reshape civil society. There's only so much I could say right now in a very brief time span, but I think it gives a little bit a sense of what you can expect from the report, and then I'm happy to talk about sort of some of the implications and what we can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quincy. I think the report is available online for free, yes?
Yes, just registration on Visegrad Insight, but it's for free.
Okay. So thank you for the report and thank you for this brief. I know for such a big report, it's hard to talk about this in 5 minutes, so thank you for being brief. And now I would like to turn to Miłosz for his remarks on the role of the civil society and politics in this region. From maybe today's perspective, but if you include some historical perspective, that would be great too. But just your reflections, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for organizing this panel that is, as Iwona said, extremely important, and I think even more important today, especially for us here in Poland, 3 days before the elections that may change the way that civil society will develop in the Poland and maybe even more in the region. And when I read the topic of our discussion, you know, and civil society and in Central Europe, and also there was the word threat there, then I thought, okay, this is actually really easy to be depressing here, to be very pessimistic, because we have Hungary, because we have Poland, and I decided that, okay, let's talk about something positive and let's talk about something optimistic. So I found like 4 trends or 4 progresses, 4 trends, let's call it trends, that are actually more optimistic and more positive, and in the recent years. So to show that there is something good in this pretty bad circumstances. So I'd like to name them and very briefly comment on them. And so number 1 is the coalition building. In most of the Central European countries or Central Eastern European countries, we could observe this process of coalition building of NGOs. Because the illiberal regimes, these oppressive states, they really used the fact that the civil society space was very much fragmented in many of our countries. And because it was fragmented, it was very vulnerable. It was more difficult to to collect funds. It was more difficult to reach the society and build their base in the community. And it was difficult to fight vis-a-vis these oppressive governments. So we could observe these coalitions, and the perfect example of it is the Hungarian coalition civilization, which was unprecedented in Hungary. It is a coalition of over 30 large NGOs, and they cooperated with many events. They organized big demonstrations, but also they together submitted a petition to the constitutional courts of Hungary against this very infamous 2017 anti-NGO act. But such examples can be observed really everywhere in the region, in the V4 region, but elsewhere, also in Latvia, for example, where organizations who are fighting for reproductive rights or sexual education rights, they also build coalitions to work together. So this is the number one trend. The number two positive trend, I would say, this is the even broader, this is the European cooperation or the transnational cooperation. So this is the trend that shows that in the time of crisis, organizations in the region, they decided to build even bigger alliances over the borders, and they use more extensively European money, especially the EEA funds and the Norway grants are here important, and all the stories, two stories about Hungary and Poland fought against this funds being distributed by independent organizations. They show how important this thing was. And with this transnational alliances, many of NGOs in the region, in the country, they understood that they are powerful, and they're powerful enough to activate, international tools like the European Commission, like the European Court of Justice, like agendas of United Nations for their own cause. So this is the trend number two that I've seen in recent years. The trend number three, very important also, is the new grass movement organizations. And this was very visible in Poland post 2015. In Poland after 2015, we had many new organizations that were born. Many of them became really powerful and important. Some of them important periodically, like the Committee of the Defense of the Democracy at the beginning, 2015, 2016, that organized big protests and demonstrations. But others that were born in 2015, 16, they had grown, and they keep on being powerful. They keep on being important actors to protect civil rights, to fight for the civil society space, but also important actors in politics, in a way, shaping politics. And here organizations like the Free Courts initiatives can be mentioned, or Akcja Demokracja, Action Democracy, who are still very active. But there's one more thing I would like to mention here in the case of Poland, is the LGBT organizations. Because often when you think about Poland post 2015 with the peace government, we think about how the LGBT rights are endangered by the government. But we had a very interesting response from the civil society. Last year, 2019, we had 24 equality marches. This is the local name for gay prides. Marching in 24 Polish cities. So in most of them for the first time, and also in smaller places. So it means that the response of the civil society toward this hostile tendencies of the government was actually to create organizations, and also very local, small organizations, and to activate the local civil society to act against this dangerous trend. So this was number three. And number four, if I still have time, I would like to mention the fact that in all the region here, Central Eastern Europe, especially Central Europe, we had this tendency, we had this trend of NGO activists or NGO leaders became active politically in party politics. So in all the countries, we had this trend that NGO leaders, they created or they joined political parties that became important, or to some extent important, on their political scene. And we can name here the Hungarian Momentum, Progressive Slovakia, Together for the People from Slovakia, or the Pirate Party from the Czech Republic. So this was another positive trend, I think, where civil society organizations who saw this illiberal trends coming up, they decided to organize themselves and to fight on a different level. So this has been this four trends that are showing that even in this very difficult circumstances, there is some positive processes going on in Central and Eastern Europe if it comes to the development of civil society.